All right, econ friends, welcome back. Starting with this video, with this topic number 7, we're going to be moving into the second of our big 3 sections. So as you recall from the syllabus and the course overview, Principles of Economics is divided into Section 1, Thinking Like an Economist, Section 2, Macroeconomics, and Section 3, Microeconomics. So you've just wrapped up your Thinking Like an Economist portion, you had your midterm, and that now takes us into our second of our big ideas, big concepts, and that is a discussion of macroeconomics. Now, macroeconomics is economics that is concerned with the big level, the national economy. So when you think about macroeconomics, you're thinking about a lot of the things that you see on the news, those big stories, GDP and trade, inflation, the stock market, those really big national-wide trends, and really those big national-wide measurements, that's macroeconomics, okay? There's a lot of specific concerns that we'll pry into over the course of this series, but just so that for now, we're moving into a new section, and we'll be discussing macroeconomics. Now, a big part of macroeconomics is data. Because macroeconomics is concerned with taking a look at the economy as a whole and ideally seeing that economy grow steadily over time to produce better standards of living, macroeconomics is really, really big on data. And there's 3 big data points that ground us in macroeconomics. In today's topic, we're going to be covering 2 of them, okay? And that's going to be real GDP and inflation. So these are going to be 2 of our big 3 macroeconomic data variables. Real GDP and inflation will be today, and then in our next video, we'll cover unemployment. So let's now jump in and get an overview of the idea of GDP. And at its core, GDP is basically a definition. GDP stands for gross domestic product. So gross domestic product, or GDP, is formally defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a given time period. Okay? Pretty straightforward definition, but a lot going on. So let's repeat it real fast. GDP, gross domestic product, is a measurement of how much stuff a country makes. And it's formally defined as the market value of the final goods and services produced within a country during a given time period. Okay? GDP is really important measurement. It's always the first one that you learn because GDP is really considered to be the most widely used measure of an overall country's economic performance. And in fact, ideas of a growing economy, say, is the economy growing? Is the economy healthy? Those discussions are almost always rooted in taking a look at a country's GDP and seeing the trends in GDP over time. Okay. Now we have this definition up here that I gave you. I want to break down a few pieces. First and foremost, GDP is final goods and services. In order to avoid double counting, intermediate goods, which would be the products that are used as inputs for other goods. Okay, so intermediate goods are not counted. So for example, in the manufacture of a new car, the manufacture of the tires, the windshield, the frame, the electronics, the braking components, all of those pieces that go into the final car, those pieces would be counted as intermediate goods, they'd be classified as intermediate goods. They would not be counted to a country's GDP. Instead, the value of the car, the final product, would be assumed to incorporate all the values of all those intermediate goods. So we strip away intermediate goods, count the value of the final goods, so that we can avoid double counting. Another thing to consider, GDP captures domestic production, which is the production within the geographical borders of a country. So here in the United States GDP consists of the market value of all final goods and services produced within the US borders. It does not matter if the item is produced by a foreign-owned firm or even by a foreign worker, production worker who's here on some sort of work visa. If it's produced within a country's boundaries, it's a part of that country's GDP. In much the same way, an American-owned company operating abroad or an American worker working in a foreign country, those contributions do not count to America's GDP. Instead, they would count to the GDP of where the item is made or where the worker is working. So we have the idea of final versus intermediate goods, and we also have the idea of domestic production. Also, GDP measures production during a specific time period, usually annually, sometimes quarterly, but there's these fixed periods in which GDP is measured. And again, the main ones would be annually and then also quarterly. So, once a year and once every 3 months. Note that the production includes all the items made during that current period. And here's a key, even if those items are unsold, okay, we call these items inventory. So if a country produces something within that given window of time, even if it's not sold, if it sits on the shelves or in a warehouse, because it was produced within that window, it counts as GDP within that window. It would be considered inventory when it's unsold, okay? And then finally, the important thing to bring up here is that GDP, again, is the market value. We said that above, that GDP is the market value of goods and services. And as a result of that, sorry about that, had a pen issue. Let me take a few seconds back. GDP is considered to be the market value of those final goods and services. So we're measuring output, we're measuring the stuff, the amount of stuff that a country makes. But critically, we're measuring it in terms of the dollar value. So if a company or if a country produces an iPad, the GDP reflects the market price paid by the consumer of that iPad. And that means that dollars are the common denominator with which GDP calculations are made. Okay, so we don't have, when we do GDP, a list of all the items made that's reported. We take all those items that are made, we determine the prices that they were sold for, and then we get the total market value by adding all those monetary values up. Okay, so critically, dollars are the common denominator. And we would say that each good that is produced in the economy increases output, increases the GDP number by the amount that the buyer pays for it. Okay, so by way of quick summary, we see again that GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a given time period. Okay, it's a really important measurement. So now that we know that, the next question is, how do we determine it? How do we calculate it? And in economics, there's a couple of ways, but there's two primary ways in which we look at and measure GDP. The first way, the most common way, and the way that we'll focus on in our class, it's going to be calculated with what is called the expenditure approach. With the expenditure approach, the total spending, again, in dollar terms, so the total spending on all goods and services that are produced within the country, within the time period, they're added together. So if you take, for example, an economy that makes 5 iPads and 1 car, and the iPads sell for $1 each and the car sells for $10, you would multiply the number of iPads, 5, times the price, $1, so that's $5. and the number of cars, 1 times the price that a car sells for, I think it was $10 I said, and then you add that together, okay? So the expenditure approach effectively takes the sum total of all of the expenditures, that is the spending that consumers make on products, adds that together, and that's the GDP. When you're talking about the expenditure approach, we're going to break all the different components of spending into 4 broad categories. Okay, this is strictly a classification method. All 4 of these things count into GDP, but because they behave in different ways, we like to suss them out. Okay, the basic idea is that GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That's our expenditure formula. It's saying again that a country's GDP, its gross domestic product, is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So let's break those pieces down, okay? The 4 components. The first one, the biggest one, is known as consumption expenditures. We call those C, that's their nickname or that's their abbreviation, it's right here. Consumption expenditures are defined as household purchases. So all the things that individual households, that people buy and sell. Note that consumption expenditures, these household purchases, they can be goods and services. Critically, they do not include housing, which we'll get back to in a bit. So consumption expenditures, including household purchases of goods and services, and those are broken down into 3 sub-pieces. So we'll say A, B, and C. And again, we break these down because the behavior of each of these varies based on economic activity. And as a result, by studying these different sub-pieces, economists can make predictions about the strength or weakness of an economy, which we'll get into a bit later. Okay. So consumption expenditures broken up into 3 pieces. The first, durable goods. Durable goods, number 1, are tangible items. They're physical things, and they're expected to last more than a year. Cars, appliances, microwaves, all those things that you buy that you intend to hold on to and use for an extended period of time would be considered durable goods. In contrast, non-durable goods are also tangible, but those are expected to be consumed in a relatively short period of time. Personal products, food, all those things that you buy and consume just to get through life, those are considered non-durable goods. Note that because non-durable goods are consumed frequently and rapidly, they're considered to be a little bit different than durable goods. And specifically, we assume in economics that durable goods and the purchase of these durable goods up here, they're going to be really, really sensitive to economic conditions. If the economy is booming, you're going to buy the same amount of gas and food as when the economy is not booming. But when the economy is booming, you're more likely to buy a new car or redo your kitchen with new appliances. And when the economy is stalling, you hold back on those things. So this distinction gives economists a clue as to economic behavior. So we have durable goods, non-durable goods, and our final category is services, which, as you know, are items of value that are intangible. The big thing to point out is that consumption spending is historically and commonly the largest, by far, the largest component of GDP. You know, by country and over time it varies, but it's a safe bet that consumption is usually right around 70% of an economy's overall value, which means that the behavior of buyers and the ability of everyday citizens to buy things is a crucial component of an economy's economic long-term performance. So we have consumption. The second of our big categories, investment expenditures. Investment expenditures, which we abbreviate as I, those refer to spending on new capital goods. Capital goods being longer-term things, but also capital goods are intended to create value. They're not the final consumption, okay? Capital goods are broken down into the following. Number one, let's put this here as A, capital goods include business fixed investment. So this is spending by businesses on physical capital. As you recall from earlier theories on production, when a company wants to produce something, the production function requires, the ability to produce requires that companies buy raw materials, which we called land, labor, and capital. Capital was the tools, the factories, the robots, the machinery, all those big expensive investments, that's why it's called investment, that allows a firm to transfer land and labor into finished things. So business fixed investment, the first category of investment is spending by a business, by a firm on physical capital. In addition, we would count under the investment category residential investment. Residential investment would be defined as spending by both households and businesses on new homes and on apartment buildings. Sorry for that pause. I'm still having some issues with this pencil. Let's bear through it and get through this real quick. So again, the second component of our investment category is residential investment, which again is spending by both households and firms on new homes and apartment buildings. And the final category, the final subgroup under investment spending would be inventory investment. And inventory investment would refer to changes in the stockpiles of both final goods and services that have been produced but unsold, as well as changes in the stockpile of the different raw materials that companies need to acquire to transfer into final goods later on, okay? Just so we know, investment, again, this second idea, the I, is typically the most volatile component. Because businesses are always looking at economic conditions, their decisions on whether to invest in really big, expensive capital purchases is really tied to the overall health of the economy. When the economy is healthy, when a company can judge that the marginal benefit will exceed the marginal cost in terms of investing, they'll say, you know what, if we pay for this big factory, the economy's booming, we're going to be able to make this money back by selling all these goods. When the economy's booming, companies will invest more. They'll invest in the new factories, robotics, all these different training programs, etc. On the other hand, when a business or a firm looks out at the landscape and they sense economic trouble, they make the judgment that, you know what, people are spending less, the economy's weak. They are not going to spend a lot of money on investment because in their mind, the probability of getting that back is low. We would say that when the economy's weak, the marginal benefits of investment do not meet the marginal cost. And as you know from our rules, companies don't do it. So it's really important to know that investment spending, business spending, is the most volatile component of GDP, and it will fluctuate considerably. Our third of the big four categories would be government purchases. The government, at all of its levels, federal, state, and local, spends money on goods and services and investments. Governments buy buildings, they buy airplanes, they pay armies, they build infrastructure. So governments spend lots of money. Our third component, government purchases, called G, is the sum total of all the spending by federal, state, and local governments on goods, services, and investments. It's worth pointing out that while most of our dialogue today, especially in the political sphere, revolves around federal spending, and the federal government does spend a lot. However, it's worth noting that state and local governments, so individual states and the counties and cities and municipalities within it, they spend far more money than the federal government, okay? State and local purchases, they exceed federal purchases by a wide margin. But the government, whether it's local or state or federal, spends a significant amount of money. And at least in the United States, over the past several decades, that amount has been steadily increasing. The one thing that I do want to point out is that government spending does not include what we're going to call transfer payments. Transfer payments are defined as payments made by the government when no goods or services are supplied. So common examples would include unemployment benefits, social health or welfare benefits, money paid in Social Security form to retired people. Since there's no goods or services supplied in exchange, this is not counted. These transfer payments, again, the transfer payments are not counted to GDP. What would end up happening is when the transfer payment is made and then the person who received it goes out and spends it, then the spending, which would be consumption, would be reflected in GDP. Okay, and our fourth and final category is net exports. Net exports equal a country's exports. So net exports equals X minus M. That's our formula. It equals a country's exports, which are produced here and sold abroad, minus a country's imports, which are foreign-made items sold here. And again, because the definition of GDP, at least a part of it, focused on goods made within a country, we're going to count exports to our GDP here because they were made here, although they were sold there. But we're going to exclude imports because they were made there abroad, but consumed here. Okay, so we take all those together, and again, to put it together, we have GDP is going to be equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And that, my friends, is the expenditure method. We take those four categories, we take the dollar value of all those goods and services, we add them together, and there you go. Now, the second approach, which is a very popular one, we're not going to really cover it in class all that much, but I want to share it with you. The second approach to calculating GDP is known as the resource cost approach, aka the income approach. In this approach, GDP is calculated by adding together all the income earned by all the resource suppliers. We learned earlier that these ideas of land, labor, and capital are bought and sold in resource markets. And we also learned the terms wage and rent and interest. And we learned that these terms simply refer to the prices that are spent on factors of production. Under the resource cost approach, aka the income approach, we can calculate GDP by simply adding together all the income earned by resource suppliers. To understand this approach, you have to bear in mind one big identity concept in economics, and that is this. By definition, every dollar that is spent by one person has to be received as income by another. Let's think about this and say it one more time. Every dollar that you spend on a product is, by definition, a dollar that is received by someone else as income. You know, that's that circular flow. That's that closed system. So again, every dollar spent on an item, expenditure, is also received as income by someone else. That's income. And as a result, we believe in economics that the dollar flow of expenditures must equal the flow of income dollars. And that's why the income approach, this approach, is another way, an equal way to calculate GDP. Okay? I do want to point out that while we're not going to really be focusing on the income approach, it does lead to a very, very critical point and a very important conclusion. Again, since every dollar that is spent on a product since every dollar of expenditure must equal a dollar of income. Here's a very important point. Increases, okay, within an economy, increases in output and the growth of income are linked. In other words, an expansion in output, which we would say is rising GDP, is the source of higher incomes. That's a really misunderstood and critical point. So we'll say it one more time. Because every dollar of spending is a dollar of income, increases in output are linked to the growth of income. Seen a different way, when a country can expand its GDP, when a country can grow over time, that is going to be one of the primary determinants of that country's income. It is no surprise that the biggest economies with the highest GDPs also have the highest income levels and all of those other traits associated with being rich world countries. Okay, so a couple final points and we'll wrap this up. Number one, GDP, very important measurement, lots going on. It's very useful. It's especially useful in calculating economic growth, which is a major part of macroeconomic thinking. However, GDP does have some limitations, and it's important that you understand that while GDP, like any tool, is useful, there are some limits to its utility. And it's up to you to be a good citizen, to be a smart economic thinker, to be able to understand some of those limitations so that you can put GDP in the proper context. What are those limitations? Well, number one, GDP does not consider the value of leisure. Number two, GDP does not factor in non-market transactions. Part of that definition at the top of this lecture said it's the market value of all final goods and services. This means that non-market transactions, for example, things that you do within the home, are not counted toward GDP. If you go to a restaurant and you buy a meal, or you take a child to daycare and pay for childcare, those expenditures would count to GDP. But producing a meal within the home, or when one of the parents stays home to watch the child, those do not count in GDP. So there's an inherent skew here that favors market transactions over more traditional non-market transactions. And that's a cause for concern at times. Third thing, GDP statistics do not reflect what we're going to call, I was saying that GDP statistics, they do not reflect what we call the underground economy. The underground economy is this whole network of unreported barter and cash transactions, as well as the market in illegal activities. So legal activities that are done in cash, for example, to avoid taxes, as well as illegal activities, things like drug traffic, prostitution, gun trafficking, things of those nature, which constitute a large amount of economic activity, they are not reflected in the GDP stats. Now, obviously, many of these underground economic transactions are not necessarily great for us, but they do constitute economic activity, and GDP fails to capture those. In addition, GDP does not reflect environmental or health issues. At the end of our last series of lectures, we covered the idea of externalities. We learned about pollution. If you think about it, when a company produces something, that production does count toward GDP. But if that production includes an externality that hurts people, while GDP counts the value of what was made, GDP does not account for the externality. So basic things like environmental or health concerns, they're not factored in. And finally, GDP is limited in how it can measure the value of quality improvements, the introduction of new goods and services, and really just general well-being in this information age. The reality is, in today's economy, products rapidly improve. GDP will tell the market value of products, but it can't talk about the improvement. In fact, picture a simple economy that only makes cell phones. Let's just say a simple economy only makes cell phones. 5 years ago, cell phones were extraordinarily expensive. 20 years ago, they were even more expensive. Today, they're relatively inexpensive. So in theory, if you were just looking at the price of the items as that kind of basic, that common value, you would say that the country's GDP fell, because as the prices of phones has gone down, the market value of the sales has gone down. But we know, of course, from everyday use, that the quality improvements in these phones, as well as the introduction of new goods and services every year, every quarter, every month, all of these things, not to mention the general idea of well-being in the information age. The fact that you can be sitting around in your pajamas watching this thrilling, informative lecture, this is something that GDP cannot measure, because it's not equipped to account for rapid improvements in quality, product development, or just general well-being in a digital information age. So there are some limits, but with that said, it's still a very important measurement. The final point that I'll make before we wrap up this goes back to that idea of price changes and the limits of GDP. So this is really important. Because GDP measures the total size of the economy in dollar terms, GDP can be a misleading measurement when prices are not stable. Let's say this again. We had said a while ago that GDP is the market value of goods and services, and that dollars are the baseline of that. It's the peg by which we measure that value. It's the common denominator. Well, since we're valuing GDP in dollar terms, anytime that prices are not stable, GDP can be a misleading measurement. Specifically, if prices are increasing, the dollar value of GDP will also increase, even if the amount of goods made remains constant. I'll repeat this one more time. If prices are increasing, the dollar value of GDP will increase even if the amount of goods and services being produced remains the same. Take a simple economy. They make 10 cars. That's it. This year, cars cost $10. Next year, they also make 10 cars, and the cars go to $20. Under our methodology for the expenditure method, this year, the GDP for the economy will be $100, and next year, $200. Somebody from the outside would say, wow, look at this economy. Last year it was at $100, now it's grown to $200. This economy is booming. But when you look underneath it, you would see that the economy has not really changed. The production has stayed steady. The economy has not grown. What has grown are prices. If the prices are not stable, specifically if prices increase, then the GDP measurements will increase even if the amount of items made stays the same. And this leads us into a discussion of major importance in economics. This leads us into a discussion on inflation. And that'll be our next topic in our next video. Econ friends, thanks for sticking through me in this one. I'm sorry for the pen issues. I will try to get this fixed so our next video is much smoother. Thanks, and I'll see you soon.